So we asked hunters about three topics: antler point restrictions, marten reintroduction, and Sunday hunting. And just a word on the methodology for conducting this survey. We sent it out via email and regular mail to 20,000 individuals. And these were individuals selected at random who had purchased a license at least 3 out of the 5 most recent seasons. So for survey purposes, we consider these to be our active hunters. These are the individuals most likely to be purchasing a license year in and year out. Received back just under 9,000 responses for a response rate around 45%, which gives us a confidence level up to 98% for questions in which everyone provided a response. The respondent profile, the average individual who responded was a male. Just over 90% of individuals who responded were male, 55 years of age. And given that, we use 55 as a dividing line from time to time in this survey. We'll give the results overall for the entire group, but then we'll also provide an age breakdown for those 55 and over and 54 and under. Again, going back again to the average individual responded, deer was the primary species that they hunted, followed by turkey, small game, and bear. The first thing we asked about was antler point restrictions. And when you think of antler point restrictions in Pennsylvania, for a lot of us, the first person that comes to mind is Gary Alt. And this iconic photo of Gary holding up 2 antlers and asking hunters which they would prefer to see, which they'd prefer to have a chance to harvest. The goal being, of course, to increase the number of adult buck in the deer population. And certainly all the harvest data since they've been implemented would indicate that is in fact what has taken place. So we first wanted to establish a baseline. Did you hunt deer before the creation of antler point restrictions? And a full 83% of our hunters have. Then we asked what best describes the quality of antler deer since antler point restrictions went into effect. And so that this wasn't entirely subjective, we asked them to consider 3 things: antler size, the apparent weight, and the apparent age of the deer. And taking those factors into consideration, would you say that the quality has gotten better? And for 70% of our hunters, they said it has improved. Then we got to really the meat of the question: should antler point restrictions continue? And overall, the results are just under 3/4 of the hunters that we surveyed wrote back and said yes, they want to see antler point restrictions continuing. This gave us an opportunity to do an age breakdown then, and again, using that 54 as the initial, or 55 as that initial dividing line. What we saw is for those under 55, 54 and younger, the support for continuing antler point restrictions increased to just under 80%. For 55 and over, there was a decrease in support, but still a full over two-thirds of hunters 55 and over said that they wanted to see antler point restrictions continuing. And then I know from time to time you'll get comments, and there was even legislation to that effect that said, what about our senior hunters? You'll hear from senior hunters who say, we feel that we should be exempted from antler point restrictions. So we looked at the overall results, and then just breaking down the senior hunters who responded, you'll see just under 2/3 of the senior hunters who responded said they wanted to see antler point restrictions continue. And what that means, and this certainly isn't unique to antler point restrictions, I think it's pretty consistent across areas of public policy, that when you're hearing from individuals saying they wish they would be discontinued, you're hearing from that 27%. And that doesn't diminish the validity of their arguments. They might have some well thought out, well-reasoned arguments for why they would like to see antler point restrictions discontinued for seniors. But in terms of whether or not they represent the majority, even within that demographic, they don't. We're still looking at just under 2/3 of hunters, senior hunters, saying they'd like to see antler point restrictions continue. Then we moved on to marten reintroduction. And as you can see, we have almost a perfect pie chart here, with about 1/3 opposing, just under 1/3 being neutral, and then slightly more than 1/3 supporting. What's really interesting about this is in all the surveys that we've done, I don't know if I can recall an instance in which we had that large a percentage who were neutral on an issue. That's just not typically the case with Pennsylvania hunters. We tend to be a pretty opinionated group. So to have about a third neutral really jumped out at us. And that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be that they feel they haven't studied the issue enough to form an opinion, or maybe they live or hunt in an area that's not being looked at for possible reintroduction, so they feel that it won't impact them. But for whatever reason, about a third of hunters who responded didn't take a position on the issue of reintroduction. Then when we did that age breakdown again, we saw that it changed based on being over or under that dividing line of 55. Those under 54 is where we saw the support increased, as well as the amount who were neutral increased, and the opposed decreased. And then the reverse was true when you went over 55. In that instance, those who were neutral decreased slightly, support decreased, and the opposition grew. And given that we were seeing what looks to be a generational divide, we wanted to look even further and break down and see which group supported reintroduction the most and which group opposed. And it does break down directly by age. Our younger hunters, 34 and younger, provided the most support and the least amount of opposition. And then for our senior hunters, 65 and older, that's where the most opposition came from and the least amount of support. So again, the reintroduction issue is one that is really turning on the generational divide from what we saw from those who responded. We asked those who were opposed to provide their reasons, and they could list more than one, which why those percentiles certainly add up to over 100, but list any reasons why you're opposed. And as you can see, predation on small game, for almost 3/4 of those who were opposed, that was their number one concern, followed by predation on turkey. And then just concerned about having another predator in general on the landscape in Pennsylvania, followed by predation on livestock, domestic animals. We then asked about Sunday hunting. And as you're well aware, of course, this is a legislative issue. Only the legislature has the authority to amend a section in Title 34 that provides for a general prohibition on Sunday hunting. The legislature did in 2019 with a bill that went into effect in 2020 that provided Sunday hunting for big game on 3 specific season dates: during deer rifle season, statewide deer archery season, and then on one day as determined by the commission. Since this law has been in effect, that one day has been put during the firearms bear season. So again, we wanted to establish that baseline. Have you hunted on any of those 3 days? And just under 2/3 of our hunters have. For those who hunted, which of those season dates? And we understand that for the firearms bear and the archery deer, there's overlap during those dates, so there's potential to be hunting additional species. But we use the language similar to what the legislation says, which is 1 day in firearms deer, 1 day in archery deer, and then a third in that firearms bear. So we asked them to indicate which one of those they hunted, and clearly firearms deer would receive the most support. Then, given that the law provides for the possibility for that third date to be selected wherever the board would like it to be, we wanted to focus on that and provide some data to you, not for the purpose of making a recommendation, but just more so to assist your decision-making process and give you another factor to look at when deciding where that date should be. So we asked, again, given that there's one date in statute that can be placed throughout, we asked our hunters to identify what their preferred season would be. And this was the results we got back. Clearly, archery deer was the preferred, followed by that firearms bear, the current option. Muzzleloader antlerless deer, third, and then spring gobbler. And there were some other ones that did not reach double-digit support, small game, fall turkey. But these were the main ones that hunters were looking at. And what was really interesting about this, when you do the age breakdown, and I provided the full age breakdown in that packet I gave you, but when you do an age breakdown, the top 2 never changed. It was always for archery deer followed by firearm bear. 3 and 4 sometimes flip back and forth. Certainly the amount of percent of support did as well, but it was always archery deer was the first preferred option. With that support starting for our younger hunters, building and peaking there at that 35 to 49 age group, where 50% of hunters surveyed there said they'd prefer archery deer. For that age group, support for firearms bear is at its lowest. Conversely, for our senior hunters, archery deer is at its lowest there with only 29%, and firearms bear is at its highest with 21%. But we know that's only one way to ask that question, because just because a hunter prefers a certain season have that Sunday hunting date, there's a full slate of potential Sundays when that season could be placed. For instance, archery, since that's the number one, there's potentially 7 Sundays throughout the archery season. So we wanted to try to narrow down more and identify which specific Sunday you'd like to see that in place. So these were the top 5 Sundays that were listed by our hunters. I should note, we asked them, they could list more than one, and they could, we asked them to rank their preference on a scale. What would be your most preferred? So these were the top 5 again. You'll see that support overall starts to build in that late October timeframe, and then peaks in early November and decreases slightly, and that November 24th date would be the proposed date for the firearms bear season. When we do an age breakdown, it's very consistent with those results across all the age cohorts, where you see that support building again at that same time frame, late to mid-October, peaking in mid or early November, and then decreasing. What's really interesting about this, I think, is for that blue line, which represents our senior hunters, it's pretty consistent all the way out across for them. We didn't see high levels of support for any specific date or for any specific season. One theory would be for our senior hunters 65 and older, a lot of whom are in a position where a day is a day. A Tuesday, Sunday, doesn't matter. They don't have the time constraints that some of our earlier hunters, our younger hunters might have. And that's why you see varying level support throughout those age groups, where time and free time is more at a premium, and they are very particular about where they would like that day to be. Then we wanted to just test in general their support for Sunday hunting. We see is a clear majority support increasing the number of days on which Sunday hunting is allowed. What is interesting is when you do a side-by-side comparison, going back to the earlier data about how many of our hunters have participated, you can see a parallel between roughly, let's say, 35% of our hunters who don't support increasing the number of days and haven't been participating in hunting on Sundays versus the 65% who are participating in either our support or are neutral toward increasing the number of days, which leads toward essentially overall for our hunters, you can reach the conclusion that as it stands currently for Sunday hunting, we're seeing about a 65-35 split. Again, about 35% not supporting, not participating, and the 65 who do support and are participating. And then we wanted to see if this breaks down by age lines as well. And we saw for the over 55 that distance between those two really starts to narrow. And at this point, we're looking at about a 55-45 split between participating, increase in number of days, versus non-participating and not supporting increase in the number of days. But what's really interesting about that is when we looked below 55, is you'll see that that gap between the two really widens. And we've gone now to about a 25-75% split, where virtually identical between that 24% that didn't participate and don't support increase in the number of days. Those are probably the same individuals there, versus the 75% plus that is participating and does support increase in the number of days. And we wanted to see which age cohort for which Sunday hunting had the most support. And it was the 35 to 49 age. Here we're looking at about an 80-20 split in favor of Sunday hunting. And what's really interesting about that is we know that this cohort, this demographic, is really important for license sales. These are the individuals who struggle the most with buying a license consistently, given how many obligations they have, how many constraints they have on their time. And what's also interesting about this demographic is there's a value added to keeping them engaged in hunting, which is they have a tendency to bring somebody else along with them, namely their children. So when you start to see this level of support, this level of participation for Sunday hunting, it raised the question of what kind of recruitment and reactivation impact was Sunday hunting having. Which leads me to this chart. So we introduced this data last year in the context of the Saturday opener, where we were wondering with that same question of what impact is it having on license sales. And now, a year later, we have additional data showing, at the very least, the decline is no longer continuing over the past couple of years, and instead it's plateauing, better described as plateauing. And on some years, it's even increasing from one year to the next, which raises the question of what is causing what we're seeing, right? And if you wanted to study cause and effect in a perfect world, you would only ever change one variable at a time, leave everything else alone for a period of years, and then you could say with a high degree of certainty, because we changed X, it resulted in Y. But you don't have that luxury when you're dealing with issues on wildlife management. And we know that there's been a lot of variables changed over this time frame. Everything from the Saturday opener in 2019, Sunday hunting in 2020. Also, we had a global pandemic. We saw a lot of extended seasons for different species. We've had increased marketing efforts, more R3 programs. We've had a new licensing system in place for 23. And I mentioned antler point restrictions and how positive they are received by our hunters. So it raises the question, which of those variables is causing the effect that we're seeing? Or is it all of the above, some combination? We can't say with any absolute certainty other than to say that hunters appear to be responding positively to the changes when we use the metric of license sales. This is something that for us, we're going to continue to dive into. We're going to continue to study it. We're going to continue to ask hunters about their preferences for these seasons and hopefully keep this trend continuing. But what I can say is I think that there's a lot of states who are probably envious of the Game Commission for a lot of reasons, and that kind of sales numbers over the past couple of years is probably at the top of the list. So I'm glad to take any questions that you have.